Hi, I'm Dr. Pam Seda. I am the owner of Seda Educational Consulting and also the co-author of Choosing to See, a framework for equity in the math classroom. All right, so today I'm going to be sharing with you 7 mistakes to avoid when differentiating for diverse learners and what to do instead. So, as I already introduced myself, I am an educational consultant, but I also am from the Peach State of Georgia. And I am the mother of 4 adult children, and I have been married for 33 years, getting ready to come up on 34 years. All right, so let's talk a little bit about differentiation. And I want to just let you know that my definition for differentiation is simply adapting your instruction to meet the varied needs of your students. It's just pretty much that simple. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about is some of the mistakes that people make when they're trying to adapt their instruction to meet the needs of their students, and some things that what we should do instead. All right, mistake number 1, using practices that undermine the confidence of your students. So many times in an effort to really try to make sure that our kids understand the standards and master the standards, sometimes we are so overly directive that we don't realize that we take over the learning process. And so it actually undermines our kids, their ability to think about what they can do mathematically. Sometimes it makes them feel like they cannot be confident because the teacher engages in practices that so much want them to learn, but oftentimes overtakes the learning process. So what can we do instead of using practices that undermine the confidence of our students? Well, I think it's real important that we learn to, when we're differentiating, including others as experts. What that means is we create classroom environments that extend beyond the teacher as the sole authority to develop competence and confidence in others as experts, including the students themselves. So what that means is that we engage in instructional routines and techniques that help build the expertise of everyone, not just the teacher. What that means is when students are asking the teacher, is this right? Is this right? That means the teacher helps ask other students that same question. They defer the questions to other. Does anyone have an answer to that question? What they do is engage in other strategies like Kagan's cooperative strategy, find someone who, where they have a worksheet that has problems on there, and they go around asking someone to explain how to do a problem, and they write down how they explain the problem, and then they explain themselves how to do another problem. So everyone has a chance to explain a problem as well as have a problem explained. Those activities like that help build the expertise of everyone in the classroom. And so that's how I think we really need to redefine expertise, not as the one person who knows everything, but the person who is able to contribute to the knowledge of the group. So that's strategy number 1. Mistake number 2, failing to acknowledge the impact of negative stereotypes on students from marginalized groups. One of the things that I find that teachers sometimes will fall into is they'll say, I don't see color. I treat all my students the same. But if you're colorblind and you choose not to see color, then you can't see how negative stereotypes impact students of color. There are all kinds of negative stereotypes out there. We weren't responsible for necessarily creating those stereotypes, but if we want to help our students overcome those stereotypes, we really have to decide to be able to look at our students, talk to our students, figure out how negative stereotypes impact them, and then choose to act upon that. So what do we do instead of not acknowledging the impact of stereotypes? Well, what we need to do instead is be critically conscious. What does that mean? That means take the time to understand how negative stereotypes impact your students and actively work to erase the effects of those negative stereotypes on the educational outcomes of marginalized students. What that means is we don't fall into stereotypical thinking, but we ask our students, we find out about them, we talk to them. In what ways, what negative messages might have you received about being a girl in mathematics? Or what negative messages have you received about your ability to do mathematics based on where you come from, based on your family history, those things. And the thing about being critically conscious is you can use your role as a teacher to help empower your students to be able to overcome those stereotypes. Critically conscious teachers understand that stereotypes are out there and that they can use their role as the authority in that classroom to help build the competence of their students, build the capacity of their students to be able to overcome negative stereotypes. So that's number 2. So what is mistake number 3? Mistake number 3 I see is assuming that that knowing your students' academic strengths and weaknesses is enough. Now that's one thing that we as teachers are compelled to do. We are compelled to figure out where our students are academically. But one of the things that we don't realize is that how things outside the classroom can impact what's inside the classroom. And so what I have found is sometimes we unknowingly think that because students are performing well in our class, that they are doing just fine. And sometimes that's not the case. And other times we assume because they're struggling in our class that things aren't okay. And unfortunately, knowing students' academic strengths and weakness isn't enough to help meet the needs of all of our diverse learners. So what should we do instead? We have to understand our students well. What that means is we have to learn about our students, their families, and communities for the purpose of improving instruction. That means we need to know that our students not only represent themselves, but they also represent a community. They come from a community. They have hopes and passions and desires that sometimes have nothing to do with academics. We need to realize that they're passionate about some things and that they are humans and deal with them as human beings. And when we do that, we can find out that we can use those things, those passions, to help them learn mathematics better. Mathematics is often seen as abstract and taught in abstract ways. But when you are able to connect to students' culture, when you're able to connect to their families, you're able to connect to things that they're passionate about, research has shown that it really does improve their academics. It improves their ability to be able to do well in mathematics. So understanding them academically is important, but we need to also understand who they are outside their classroom, because before they ever set foot in your classroom, they were fully human and they had wants and desires. And it's important for us to be able to tap in that to help them see how mathematics connects to their passions, connects to things that they want to do, so that we can uncover the brilliance of all of our students. So what is mistake number 4? Mistake number 4, I find, is using instructional materials in ways that perpetuate stereotypes. So I understand that most of us, most as teachers, we don't necessarily get to choose our curriculum. It is what it is. But sometimes unknowingly, our curriculum materials can perpetuate stereotypes by their absence of students of color, or their absence of students' stories that represent your students. Oftentimes in their absence, students can think that, oh, well, I don't see anyone who looks like me in this curriculum, so that must mean math is not for me. Or sometimes students can think that math is the domain of white males, because historically, those are the only stories that have been told. So what is something that we can do instead of perpetuating those stereotypes? It's use culturally relevant curricula. Use instructional materials in ways that help students see themselves as doers of mathematics and help them overcome the negative stereotypes and messages regarding who is and who isn't mathematically smart. I share this picture here because the young lady in purple is my daughter. I remember when she was sometime in elementary school that she was very artistic, even though I was a math major, my husband was a computer science major. We were very STEM oriented. In addition to math and science, she was very artistic. And so I thought that architecture would be a great field for her to pursue because it was a good blend of both of those areas. And when I mentioned it to her, she wasn't remotely interested. She said, nope, she wasn't interested. But sometime in middle school, she went with her Girl Scout troop to Georgia Tech, and she had the chance to listen to a Black female architect speak to their group. And from that time on, she says, that's what I want to be. I want to be an architect, and I want to go to Georgia Tech. And I am proud to say that she went to Georgia Tech. She got her bachelor's and her master's in architecture. And she is now one of the 0.2% of licensed architects who are Black female architects. So I just share that story to show you how important representation is, that representation really does matter, and how you use curriculum materials really is important. It's also important that you use materials in ways so that students are doing the mathematics. And what I mean by doing mathematics is that they're noticing patterns, describing patterns, and generalizing patterns. So much of what we give to students is asking them to mimic procedures that someone else has discovered, somebody else has noticed, and the teacher tells you, here's the procedure, I need you to mimic this procedure. That's not doing mathematics. Our brains are hardwired to notice patterns. And so if all of us can notice patterns, then what our job as teachers is to help them describe those patterns and help them generalize those patterns. And that all students could do it, not just those who we think are high flyers, but we need to use materials in ways so that all students can see themselves as mathematically smart. All right, mistake number 5, assuming students' previous experiences and knowledge are irrelevant. And I have this picture of this blank iPad because oftentimes as teachers, especially when we're trying to differentiate instruction, we just assume that students come to us as blank slates and that it's our job just to give them the information that they need to be able to perform well on tests. So what should we do instead of assuming that their knowledge is irrelevant? Well, what we need to do is assess, activate, and build on their prior knowledge. Assess means take the time to find out what students already know. Don't assume they don't know anything. Even if it's informal knowledge, it's information that we could use for instruction. Activate means sometimes there's knowledge in their brains that hasn't been used for a while. There's a little dusty, and we need to engage students in activity to bring it to the forefront of their brains so that they can use it and it can be built on. And then there's sometimes we have to build on prior knowledge, that there are sometimes learning gaps that students don't necessarily have the prerequisites that they need, and we need to specifically focus on ways to do that. So the way I've defined this principle is that we need to value the prior knowledge that students bring to the classroom, both personal and cultural, and leverage that knowledge as a resource for creating new knowledge. And one of the things that I realized was that as a high school teacher, that I always had students who didn't know what they were supposed to, but I felt that they were supposed to know. And so I would sometimes say things like, oh, you didn't learn that in 4th grade? You don't remember how to do this from middle school? And I didn't really think about the impact of that on my students and how that made them feel. And what I began to realize was that even long before COVID, that I always had students that I had to either build in that prior knowledge or reactivate that prior knowledge. And so I just learned to incorporate and normalize filling in learning gaps. So I did it just in time. I did make the mistake one year, my very first year of teaching, of spending the first week of school, going back over and reteaching the curriculum that I thought was most needed for algebra 9th graders. And then I started teaching from there. And what I found was when I got to the section that they needed, I had to reteach it again. So I realized I had kind of really wasted that whole week of school. So what I realized is that students need just in time activation of that prior knowledge, just in time building on that prior knowledge. Give them just enough so that they can be able to access the new content that you're giving them, but do it just in time. So that is that mistake. All right, mistake number 6, depriving students of agency and limiting their autonomy in the learning process. And this is pretty much a lot of times connected to mistake number 1, but this has to do with the fact that sometimes we really want students to own their learning, but then we control every aspect of the learning process. And then we forget that students really do have agency. They really can choose to engage in the mathematics, or they can choose not to, and that there's a lot of things that as teachers in the classroom that we can do to either encourage their agency or undermine that agency. So what should we do instead? We need to release control. And what does that mean? It means that you need to empower your students to take ownership of their learning by focusing on sense making and allow them to make choices about things that are important to them in the classroom. So this principle has 2 parts. The first part is sense making. So much of what we give students in our math classes are really here, just follow my procedure, whether they make sense to the students or not. The problem with that is if it doesn't make sense to the students, they're not going to retain it. They may retain it at best on the test, but they won't retain it to the end of the year, and they won't retain it for the next year. And the information that they'll need to use as a foundation for you to build on for the next year won't be there if it doesn't make sense to students. It is really important that we allow kids to make sense. So I've had several people talk to me about, or I've seen in classrooms where they've talked about the gradual release of responsibility, where it's I do as a teacher, I show you the problem, then we do it together, and then you do it by yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that process, except it starts with the teacher. We need to give students some opportunities to make sense before I start doing. So oftentimes what I might give a activating strategy where I might provide some visual representation, or I might show a video where this math might be used in context. And I start asking kids to tell me, what do they notice? They get the chance to look at the structure of what the math is first, grapple with it by themselves, grapple with it with another person, and then I do the I do. Because what I find is that when I then give the information and I start talking, they have something to connect it to, and that it will help make sense. But if I don't give them those experiences first to grapple with the ideas in the math before I start teaching vocabulary or before I start telling them the formulas, then I find that they don't have anything to anchor that information to, and it goes in one ear and right out the other. So that's the first part. And then the second part is students need to be able to make choices about things that are important to them in the classroom. Now, I understand that because traditionally we oftentimes give students very few choices to make, that you don't want to just turn your class over to the students to make all the choices in class. You'll probably want to start small. And so I would maybe sometimes do things as simple as give my students 2 to 3 writing prompts at the end of the day and say, here are some choices. So one of the ways that I did it was I gave 3 writing prompts at the end of the day for them to reflect on their learning as a closing. So one of those writing prompts would always be, which mathematical practice did you engage in today and how? Then another mathematical practice had to do with the emotions that are most connected to being able to delay gratification and accomplish our goals. And those emotions are pride, gratitude, and compassion. So I might ask a question like, what did you do that made you proud today? Or somebody else, I might, another day, I might say, who did you help today and how did it help them? Or I might say, what are you grateful for in this math class? So, and then the third question might be something about the content for that day. And it might be, how did you, what mistake did you make today and how did you correct it? So those are some examples of choices. I also sometimes allowed students to choose how did they get the chance to demonstrate mastery? How did they want to be able to show mastery? Sometimes I let students create their own assessments. Sometimes I let them create their own problems. Sometimes I would give them a choice board, so where they'd have several different types of problems that they could choose to be able to demonstrate mastery. But research really shows that when students are given autonomy to make choices, they're more engaged and they just tend to do better. So even in differentiating for students, it's important to give students choice about how they learn and how they demonstrate their mastery of their learning. All right, mistake number 7, prejudging the capabilities of students based on their backgrounds or perceived disadvantages. So many times, I've been guilty of this, where I've seen where students have had poor math history, or even in my class, and they failed test 1, test 2, and then I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure how they're going to even be able to learn this new content. They don't even know their times tables. And then I find out that they blow me out the water. I've been proven wrong so many times. But it's too many times we put labels on students and we prejudge them based on those labels rather than labeling the mathematics that we ask kids to do. I've heard people call mathematics as spicy or medium or hot. But then there are ways that we can prioritize and label the mathematics rather than the student. So what should we do instead? We should expect more. We have to hold high expectations for all students and avoid deficit views of diverse learners. So what that means is that it doesn't mean that we don't recognize the weaknesses of students. It just means we don't define them in terms of their weaknesses. It means that instead of just seeing students what they do wrong, it means focus on what do they know, what did they do right first, and then thinking about how to use their strengths to be able to address those weaknesses. So I'm thinking of times that we've looked at and say, the kid doesn't know their times tables, so how can I teach them pre-calculus? And I have had pre-calculus students who didn't know their times tables. But instead of thinking about that, think about what are they able to do? And I find that oftentimes students are able to solve equations, or they're able to calculate and compute those times tables very quickly in their heads, even though they may not know them immediately. So there's so much more mathematics that they can do. And instead of thinking of them in terms of just their weaknesses, it means having those high expectations and helping them recognize that they are capable. So what are some of the ways that I've done that? Well, one of the ways that I do that is if I've communicated to my student that they should not allow anyone to GPS them. And what does GPS mean? Well, I know when I use a GPS to drive, I am directionally challenged. So while the GPS gets me there very easily, what I find is that it's very difficult for me to get back there by myself, right? Because when you use a GPS, it doesn't use your sense of direction. It doesn't use line marks. I'm just paying attention to wherever it's saying go, and I go. And I'm not really paying attention to what's going on around me. And unfortunately, most of us have had some kind of experience where we can say the GPS led us astray. So what I have done is recognize that with my students, when I GPS them, I've handicapped them in the same way because I have not built the procedural skills on their number sense. So when I tell my students, don't let anybody GPS you, that means only do something that someone tells you to do if it makes sense to you. Rely on that sense making. And if it doesn't make sense to you, then you ask questions and continue to ask questions or get clarity so that it does make sense to you. And one of the ways that I knew that routine or the expectation had really caught on in my class was when I was giving some support or help to a student and she turned around and looked at me and she says, "Stop GPSing me." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I stand corrected." But I was so happy that she had learned to not allow people to GPS her. The other thing is to make sure that we use asset-based language instead of talking about what students know, instead of saying, these are my level 1 kids or these are my low achieving kids. You can think about it and turn around and say, these are the students that we're still trying to figure out how we can best support them to help them achieve, right? It's just a different mindset, and the language that we use with our students really, really does matter. So those are the 7 mistakes that I oftentimes see teachers make when it comes to differentiating instruction. And so here are the 7 things to do, because I really want you focusing on what to do and not necessarily the mistakes. So those 7 principles that I just gave you are from the book Choosing to See, and it's what I call the ICU CARE framework, ICU CARE. And each one of those letters represents the principles I just shared with you. I's include others as experts. The first C is be critically conscious. U is understand your students well. The second C is use culturally relevant curricula. A, assess, activate, and build on prior knowledge. R, release control. And E, which is expect more. And so these are really ways to think about your instruction, including differentiation, because I have seen so many people lower their expectation for students all in the name of differentiation. And as in the words of Ken Williams, he says, life doesn't level down for you. Life doesn't level down for you. And so we shouldn't level down for our students and think that somehow we're helping them because we lower our expectations for them. Differentiation and meeting their needs really means providing them the tools and the supports so that they can reach the high expectations. And part of it is us communicating to them that we believe in them and their ability to be able to meet our expectations. There's actually been a research on what's called wise feedback. And wise feedback is when teachers communicate to students that I have high expectations and I'm giving you this feedback because I believe you can meet these expectations. And what the research has shown that improves the performance of all students, but especially students from marginalized groups. When they get that type of feedback, they have seen improved academic achievement. So those are the 7 mistakes and the 7 things that we can do about it. So what I would like for you to do right now is I want you to think about what you want to do as a result of this learning. In essence, I call this a call to action. And so the first question I want you to answer is, I used to think blank, but now I think blank. I want you to answer that question. I used to think blank, but now I think blank. And then I also want you to answer the question of what will you do to apply what you've learned from today's session? What will you do to apply what you learned from today's session? And I really would like for you to place your responses on the call to action form. You can use this QR code to access it, or you can use tinyurl.com/Seda call to action. So if you could please place your responses there, I would greatly appreciate it. And so I would love for you to subscribe to my newsletter so that we can stay in touch. And I am available to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you for joining this time with me. All righty. So Kimberly, I see that you have asked a question about talking with policymakers, higher education colleagues, and school administrators about these ideas. I don't have any formal way of thinking about it, but I do know that every opportunity that I get to talk with people about these ideas, I do. Whether it's, I find the informal conversations are really the most powerful ones. I remember I was at a friend's birthday party, and some of my colleagues I hadn't seen from a long time, some friends from a long time, they came up to me, what is all this about, this new math, and what are they doing about this stuff? Common Core math. They were kind of speaking very derogatorily about it. And I just kind of explained to them, I said, the math has not changed. It's not new math. The math is the same. What has changed is our level of expectation for our kids to be able to understand it, because we need them to be able to, and then I would say share a lot of these very same ideas. I find that I found out even after the end of that conversation, they were like, yeah, you need to tell this to everybody. And I was like, you do too. And so I would just say, wherever you have that chance, just speak in, put yourself in parents' shoes, put yourself, in their shoes, and speak to what everyone generally wants. We want kids to be able to solve problems. Lord knows our world has a lot of problems to solve. And when you situate it in those terms and help people look more long-term rather than just looking at preparing kids for tests, but we think about helping them, preparing them to engage in the reasoning and the thinking skills that they need to be able to solve the problems of this world. I found that people are very accepting of it. I just think we need to be a little bit more proactive about our message. I know oftentimes as an educator, I wasn't involved with politics at all. I was like, I got work to do. I'm working with kids. But then who did that leave to tell our stories? And so I would just say, hey, tell your stories. Tell the stories about kids whose lives have been changed because you engage them as thinkers and reasoners. And tell the stories about, the students who society has decided is not a math person and how they become math people and the agency. So I just say, tell our stories. Does anyone else have any other questions that you'd like for me to answer? I so appreciate, Helena Marie, that you did come to my session and you didn't let the word mistake keep you from coming to the session. And I think when you just said sensible, I think that is our way to get to the hearts of policymakers, our colleagues, school administrators, is help them understand that we are being sensible. These are the things, these are based on interactions that we've had with students. And I think that's our way forward. Thank you, Kimberly. Is there any idea that resonated with you the most? I do see that you made a comment that you like the analogy about not letting students GPS you. Is there anything else that stood out? All right. Well, doesn't seem like there's any questions. So I really appreciate you coming to my session. And I hope that we stay in touch. Please, please, please complete the call to action form. Sign up for my newsletter. And I would love to hear from you about how you implement these ideas in your classroom. Thank you so much. Take care.